My name is Rachel, and for 11 years I let my husband's family believe I drove that 10-year-old Honda because it was all I could afford. I let them believe a lot of things, that I was the quiet one who never quite caught up, that I was lucky Michael even noticed me, that the vague thing I did for work involved a lot of driving and not much else. I let it happen because correcting people takes energy I never had time for, and because somewhere underneath all of it, a part of me agreed with them, or at least believed I had no real right to argue. Then one August night, on the worst evening of my adult life, a helicopter set down on a rooftop in downtown Denver, and every single person who had ever laughed at my shoes found out exactly who had been standing in front of them the whole time. I did not raise my voice once. I did not have to. Have you ever sat at a table where everyone was laughing and you understood with total clarity that you were the joke? Not a joke that included you, a joke about you, dressed up as affection so nobody had to feel bad about it later. Maybe it was your parents comparing you out loud to a sibling who did things the way they had always imagined success should look. Maybe it was coworkers who assumed your quiet meant empty rather than full. I want you to really sit with that question before I keep going. Because what happened to me at that dinner has probably happened to you in some smaller version, at some kitchen table, at some office party, at some family gathering where you were the one everybody quietly agreed had not done as well. If this story feels familiar already, stay with me to the end, and if you want more of these true stories, hitting subscribe costs nothing, and it is genuinely the only reason this channel gets to keep telling them. I met Michael when I was 25, working a night shift transport, and he was doing rotations at the same hospital as a new accountant handling the billing side of emergency services, of all things. The two of us bonding over vending machine coffee at 3 in the morning, more times than either of us admitted to anyone else at first. He was steady in a way I had never experienced before, unimpressed by drama, easy to be quiet around, without it meaning anything was wrong, and I fell for him slowly instead of all at once, which felt at the time like the safest kind of falling there was. What I did not fully understand yet was that marrying into a family is its own kind of merger, and that the quiet, careful person I was becoming with him would eventually have to sit across a table from people who had already decided, long before they met me, exactly how much space I was allowed to take up. The conflict was never really about a broken-down car or a pair of flats with a scuff on the left toe. It went back years, to the very first Thanksgiving I spent with the Whitmore family, when my mother-in-law, Lauren, looked at my chipped nail polish and asked in front of everyone if I had considered that Michael could have married someone a little more put together. I remember exactly where I was standing, by the sideboard, with a serving spoon still in my hand, and how the room did not go quiet so much as it simply continued, as though nothing unusual had been said at all. Nobody defended me. Michael squeezed my hand under the table and said nothing out loud, and I told myself that was enough because I had grown up learning that the loudest thing you could do in a room like that was stay calm. I was 26 years old. I did not know yet how much that single skill would cost me over the next decade, or how good I would eventually become at paying that cost without anyone noticing. I grew up in Craig, a small town on the western slope of Colorado, where the nearest trauma center was almost 2 hours away by road, and the radio in our kitchen was always tuned low to the emergency scanner, a habit my father never broke even at the dinner table. He was a volunteer firefighter and EMT, the kind of man who kept a second radio on his nightstand in case the tone went off at 3 in the morning, who taught me to read a map before he taught me to ride a bike, because he said knowing where help could actually reach you was the difference between panic and a plan. When I was 19, he was pinned under a truck on a job site 45 minutes outside of town, and the closest medical helicopter was based so far away that by the time it landed, it was already too late. I remember standing in a hospital hallway in my work uniform, still smelling like the diner where I waited tables, watching my mother fold and refold the same paper cup until it fell apart in her hands, understanding for the first time that geography could be the difference between a father and no father at all. That morning changed the entire shape of my life. There is a particular kind of shame that settles into you as a kid, when you are the one wearing the same 3 shirts on rotation while other kids talk about vacations you have never taken, And I carried that shame long before I ever met a Whitmore. In 6th grade, a girl named Amanda pointed out, in front of the whole cafeteria, that my sneakers had a hole worn through near the little toe, and I remember spending the rest of that year keeping my feet tucked under my chair whenever I could, as though invisibility were something you could arrange one body part at a time. My mother worked doubles at the diner just to keep the lights on after my father's disability claim, got tangled in paperwork for months, and I learned early that being poor in a small town was not a private fact. It was a public performance everyone else got to watch and comment on, which is maybe why, years later, a joke about my shoes at a fancy restaurant landed somewhere so much older and deeper than that one dinner. I became an EMT before I turned 20. Then a flight paramedic. Then I went to flight school on nights and weekends while working full shifts because I had decided somewhere in that hospital hallway that no family in a rural county would ever again wait for help that could not reach them in time. There were years in there I do not talk about much. The year I lived in a converted garage to save on rent. The year a business loan almost fell through 2 days before payroll, and I sat in my car in a parking lot doing math on a napkin until 3 in the morning. The year I flew a transport myself with a fever of 101 because there was no backup pilot and a patient who could not wait. It took 12 years, 3 loans I signed with my hands actually shaking, and a lot of nights sleeping in the office of a rented hangar. But I built a company called Timberline Air Rescue from a single second-hand aircraft into a fleet that now covers a dozen rural counties across the state. I never told the Whitmores the real size of what I had built, and it was not modesty exactly. It was self-protection, because I had already learned what happened when I let this family see me as more than they had decided I was allowed to be. The one time I tried to explain any of it at a birthday dinner 4 years into my marriage, I mentioned that Timberline had just closed a funding round to buy our 3rd aircraft, and for one bright foolish second, I actually let myself feel proud out loud at that table. Lauren laughed, not unkindly on the surface, and said something about how sweet it was that I called my little side project a company, then changed the subject to Brian's newest real estate deal before I could finish a sentence, and Gary chuckled along in that easy way he had of following whatever direction his wife's attention pointed. I remember Michael's jaw tightening, and I remember deciding right there over a lukewarm slice of cake that I would never bring up my work at that table again. It was easier to let them believe I did something small and vaguely medical than to fight for a version of the truth nobody at that table wanted to hear. And somewhere in that decision I also buried the part of myself that still wanted, even after everything, for this particular family to be proud of me. What none of them knew either was how many times I had quietly fixed things for this family without ever once being asked to, and without ever once mentioning it afterward. 3 years earlier, when Gary needed a cardiac procedure that insurance only partly covered, I paid the remaining balance through my lawyer under a name that was not mine, and let everyone believe a generous hospital financial program had simply come through. When Brian's first development deal collapsed and he quietly needed a bridge loan to avoid losing his house before anyone in the family found out, I was the anonymous private lender his broker arranged, structured so carefully that Brian still believes to this day it came from an investment group downtown. I was always the one who paid, always the one who consented, always the one who found the quiet solution and then disappeared from the story before anyone had to thank me, because gratitude from this family had always come with strings I did not want to hold. There was a third time, too, one I have never told anyone outside of my own lawyer. The year Lauren and Gary's roof needed replacing after a hailstorm, and their insurance claim was denied on a technicality neither of them understood how to fight. I paid a contractor directly and told them a home warranty program I had never heard of before that morning had covered it, inventing the name on the spot and hoping neither of them would ever look closely enough to find out it did not exist. I do not say any of this to make myself sound like a saint, because I was not being generous so much as I was terrified of what it would mean if this family ever had to actually need me out loud, if they ever had to see me as someone worth needing instead of someone to gently, endlessly correct. So when Gary and Lauren's 35th wedding anniversary came around, and Brian announced he was hosting the whole family at a restaurant called Altitude, on the top floor of the Bellwether Tower downtown, I did what I always did. I said yes, I bought a dress, and I quietly checked my work calendar to make sure nothing at Timberline would need me that night, the way I checked it before every family event. A small private ritual nobody else knew I performed. Everything looked clear. What I did not know yet was that a 16-year-old named Casey was about to be pulled from a car wreck outside Craig, the same stretch of road where my father had been hurt, and that by the time dessert was served, my ordinary quiet life and my other life would collide in front of 40 people holding champagne glasses. I want to be honest with you. Nothing about that afternoon felt like the beginning of anything except an ordinary, slightly dreaded family dinner, the kind where you rehearse your smile in the car before you even reach the parking garage and remind yourself out loud sometimes that it is only 3 hours and then you get to go home. I had picked out low-block heels I could actually walk in, packed a pair of flats in my bag out of habit, the same habit that had saved my ankles on 100 late-night helicopter pads, and left my house with plenty of time to spare, humming along to the radio, feeling almost light-hearted for once. I had no idea that habit, packing shoes I could run in, was about to be the exact detail that Brian would use to humiliate me in front of his most important guests before the night was even half over. Traffic downtown was worse than usual because of a Rockies game letting out early, so I left extra time, which is the only reason what happened next did not make me late. 2 blocks from the restaurant, in the parking garage under a building I use sometimes for client meetings, my old Honda made a grinding sound and the dashboard lit up with warning lights I recognized from a bad alternator. The kind of thing I'd been meaning to fix for months and kept putting off because Timberline's maintenance budget always seemed more urgent than my own car, an old joke between Michael and me that had stopped being funny somewhere around year 8. I sat there for a second with my hands on the wheel, laughing a little at the timing of it, then did the math the way I did math for everything. 2 blocks, 12 minutes on foot in low heels, less in flats. I decided walking was faster than waiting for a tow truck. I did not have time for anyway, and there was something almost peaceful in how quickly I made that decision. No drama, just logistics. I could have called Michael, who was already at the restaurant with his parents. I could have called an assistant or a car service or, honestly, any one of a dozen people at Timberline who would have dropped what they were doing to help me without a second thought. I did not because some old stubborn part of me still believed that asking for help over something as small as a broken alternator would confirm every quiet judgment this family had ever made about me, that I was the one who could not quite manage her own life, the one whose small failures were always slightly more visible than everyone else's. So I took off my heels, put on the flats I always carried, tucked my hair back with the clip that would not survive the humidity anyway, and walked the 2 blocks in August heat that had not cooled off even after 7 in the evening, my dress sticking to my back by the time I reached the entrance of the Bellwether Tower, my feet already aware of the blister forming at my left heel. I passed a street musician playing something slow on a saxophone near the corner of the block, and for half a second, I thought about stopping to catch my breath in the shade of the awning above his open case, but the 12 minutes I had budgeted did not leave room for half seconds, so I kept walking, counting the cross streets the way I counted altitude on approach. A habit that made the whole city feel briefly like just another kind of instrument panel. A man in a delivery uniform held a door for me at the corner without looking up from his phone, the only person on that entire walk who treated me like exactly what I was, a woman in a hurry, nothing more remarkable than that. And there was something almost funny about how much kinder a total stranger managed to be in 4 seconds than my in-laws would manage to be in the next 3 hours. By the time I stepped into the lobby, my hairline was damp, a strand had come loose from the clip I had carefully pinned that afternoon, and my flats, comfortable and completely wrong for a restaurant, with a dress code printed on a little brass sign by the host stand, looked exactly like what they were. The host at Altitude glanced at my shoes, then at his list, then back at my shoes. his expression carefully neutral in the way people trained in hospitality practice for exactly this situation, and asked with the particular politeness people use when they are deciding whether you belong somewhere if I was certain I had the right reservation. I told him I was with the Whitmore party, and he asked me to wait while he confirmed it, as though a woman in flats might be lying her way into a private family dinner on the 40th floor. And I stood there in that gleaming lobby, watching other guests in cocktail dresses and press suits move past me without a second glance, feeling not for the first time in my life entirely see-through. When I finally walked into the private room, flushed and a little breathless, Brian was already standing near the head of the table with a glass in his hand, mid-conversation with a man I did not recognize in an expensive-looking suit, the two of them laughing at something in the easy, self-satisfied way men laugh when they believe they are the most important people in any room they enter. He turned, saw me, and his face did that thing it always did when he found an opening he could not resist, a kind of brightening that had nothing to do with warmth. "Well, look who made it," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "In her running shoes, no less. I don't think Rachel's ever met an Uber she couldn't skip." The table laughed, not cruelly exactly, the way people laugh at a joke they have heard 40 times before, which somehow made it worse because it meant this was not new. It was simply who they had always believed I was. I felt my face go hot, and for one long second, I considered turning around and walking straight back out the way I had come. Back down 40 floors, back into the heat, back to a version of the evening where nobody's eyes were on me at all. Instead, I did what I have always done in that family, since the very first Thanksgiving with the chipped nail polish. I smiled, I said something light about my car giving out on me, and I found a seat because making a scene had never once in 11 years gotten me anything except the label of being dramatic, a label this family handed out to any woman who dared to look even slightly wounded by their affection. I have spent my whole adult life being the one who absorbs the joke so the evening can keep moving, the one who pays quietly when something needs fixing, the one who stays calm so nobody else has to feel uncomfortable, and in that moment I understood, with a tiredness that went all the way to my bones, that none of that patience had ever once been noticed, let alone repaid. The seat that had been left for me was at the far corner of the table, past the dessert cart station, close enough to the kitchen door that a server bumped my chair twice, bringing out trays for the rest of the party, murmuring a quick apology both times without quite meeting my eyes. Michael, seated near his parents at the center of the table, where the good conversation and the good wine were happening, gave me an apologetic look across the room, the kind of look that meant he knew this was wrong, but was not going to say anything about it either, a look I had learned, over 11 years, to receive without visible reaction. Jessica, Brian's wife, leaned over at one point to ask, with wide, sympathetic eyes, whether I ever got tired of driving that little car everywhere, phrased like concern, landing like something else entirely, and I noticed, the way I always noticed, the quick glance she gave her own reflection in the dark window afterward, checking her lipstick, already finished with me. Over the next half hour, while plates of seared scallops and dry-aged steak circled the table, I collected small cuts the way I always did at these dinners, filing them away instead of letting them land. A skill so practiced by now it barely registered as pain anymore, more like a familiar ache in an old injury. Gary asked, not unkindly, whether I had found steady work yet, as though 11 years of employment could be erased by not knowing the specifics of it, and I answered with something vague and pleasant about staying busy. Lauren mentioned, apropos of nothing, that she had run into an old friend whose daughter-in-law had just made partner at a law firm downtown, then looked at me with an expression that did not need words attached to it, and I felt the familiar, silent comparison land exactly where it was aimed. I answered every question politely, ate my dinner, and thought, the way I often did in that room, about the fleet manifest sitting open on my phone in a folder nobody at this table had ever asked to see. 3 aircraft scheduled for maintenance that week, a new contract renewal due in October, a whole complicated life running quietly underneath the one they had decided to see. At one point, Gary leaned across the table, wine in hand, and told a story I had heard at least 4 times before about how worried he and Lauren had been, early on, that Michael was moving too fast, marrying a girl who worked, in his words, an ambulance job with no real ceiling, and how relieved they were that Michael had turned out fine anyway, as though I were a risk that had simply failed to metastasize. Michael laughed along uncomfortably, the way he always did with that particular story, and I smiled and nodded because that had always been my role in it, the cautionary anecdote that ended happily by accident rather than the person who had actually built something. I remember thinking quite calmly that he had no idea how close that story was to being told very differently one day. Somewhere around the second course, I caught myself doing the math I always did in these situations, calculating exactly how much longer I needed to stay pleasant before I could reasonably excuse myself. 90 minutes, maybe less if dessert came early. Then my phone buzzed once against my thigh, a single controlled vibration I recognized instantly. The alert pattern Timberline used for priority dispatch, not casual chatter. A sound my body had been trained to respond to, the way some people respond to their own name. I did not look at it right away. I finished chewing, smiled at something Gary said about golf, and felt my pulse pick up in a way that had nothing to do with the humiliation of the last hour and everything to do with the fact that somewhere out past the mountains a call had just come in that I already suspected would end my evening early and possibly end it in a way none of these people were prepared for. I excused myself quietly, saying I needed the ladies' room, and stepped into the hallway outside the private dining room to check my phone properly, the noise of the party fading behind the heavy door as it swung shut. The message was from James, my director of flight operations, and the closest thing I had to family outside of Michael, and it was short in the clipped, efficient way we had trained ourselves to write under pressure. No wasted words, no punctuation for feeling. 16-year-old single vehicle rollover, 40 minutes outside Craig, incoming weather in the pass, County Memorial requesting immediate transport to Denver Children's. Then, underneath it, one more line that made my stomach drop, for reasons that had nothing to do with logistics. Pilot roster shows you on call tonight. Confirm availability. I stood in that hallway in my flats, my back against cool marble, reading the words twice, and understood exactly where the rest of my night was going. I typed back 3 words, confirmed 10 minutes because that was genuinely all the thought it required, the decision made somewhere below language before I had even finished reading the message. In 11 years of marriage, I had never once put a dinner ahead of a transport request, and I was not about to start on the night everyone at that table had already decided I did not matter enough to interrupt anyway. Still, some old habit made me hesitate before walking back into that dining room, a small calculation about how to explain leaving early without giving away more than I wanted to give away, a habit of concealment so deep it had become almost automatic. I decided I would simply say something had come up at work, vague enough to satisfy no one, specific enough to be true, and let them draw whatever small, unimpressive conclusion they wanted to draw. It would not be the first time I had let this family underestimate the shape of my life to keep the peace, and standing there in that hallway, I felt for just a moment the full accumulated weight of every time I had made that same choice. When I sat back down, Lauren asked if everything was all right, in a tone that suggested she expected the answer to be some minor domestic inconvenience, a forgotten errand, or a babysitter falling through. I told her something at work needed my attention, and that I might have to step out before dessert. Brian, overhearing, laughed and said he did not realize ambulance driving came with emergency phone calls during other people's anniversary dinners, and Jessica added that it must be hard, always being on call for such an important job, her mouth twitching at the word important in a way that told me exactly how small she believed that job to be. I let it pass, the way I let everything pass, and reached for my water glass instead of a response, watching the ice settle, feeling the cold of the glass against my palm, like something to hold on to. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to ask in 11 years, was that the vague work emergency I had just mentioned involved a teenage boy bleeding internally on a gurney in a rural hospital, 40 minutes outside the town where my own father had died, waiting for help that came too late. What none of them knew was that within the hour a helicopter with my company's name painted on the tail boom would be landing on the rooftop pad 2 buildings over, because Timberline held the exclusive contract for that corridor precisely because I had built it to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy from ever happening to another family the way it had happened to mine. I sat at that table smiling politely at jokes about my flats, carrying all of that inside me like a stone in my chest, and said nothing because I had learned a long time ago that this family only ever heard what confirmed what they already believed, and correcting them mid-dinner would only ever be filed away as me making things about myself again. The next 20 minutes moved strangely, the way time does when part of your attention is somewhere else entirely, already halfway up a mountain pass while the rest of you sits smiling over dessert menus. I watched the clock on my phone under the table more than I watched anyone's face, counting minutes the way I counted them during any transport, silently, automatically. I answered a follow-up text from James confirming weather was holding for now, but closing fast over the pass, which meant every minute I stayed at that table was a minute closer to a window I could not afford to miss. Meanwhile, Gary told a long story about a golf trip. Lauren corrected small details of it twice, and Brian used the pause to launch into an update about his newest development, a luxury subdivision going up outside Steamboat that he described more than once as the kind of project that separated people who built real wealth from people who just got by, his voice rising slightly with each repetition of the phrase as though testing how much room the table would give him. Brian and Michael had been competing for their parents' attention since they were boys, and Michael had lost that particular contest so many times growing up that he had simply stopped entering it by the time I met him, choosing steadiness over spectacle in a way his family mistook for a lack of ambition. Brian, on the other hand, had built his entire adult personality around never losing again, which meant every family gathering doubled as a stage for whatever his newest win happened to be, and it meant that anyone sitting quietly nearby, especially a sister-in-law who had never once tried to compete with him for anything, became useful scenery for the kind of contrast that made his own story shine brighter. By the time the dessert plates arrived, Brian had a glass of champagne in his hand and an expression I recognized from every family gathering for the last decade, the specific look of a man about to make himself the center of attention under the cover of celebrating someone else. He tapped his fork against the glass, and the table quieted, and he began talking about his parents' 35 years together, which was sincere for about 4 sentences before it curved, as it always did, into a speech about ambition and legacy and what it meant to actually build something instead of coasting through life waiting for things to happen to you, his free hand gesturing broadly around the room as though the restaurant itself were evidence of his point. Then Brian's eyes found me down at the far end of the table near the kitchen doors, and his voice picked up that particular warmth people use right before they say something cruel and call it honesty. He said the family had all kinds of people in it, the ones who chased something bigger and the ones who were happy staying exactly where they landed, and that there was nothing wrong with that. Gesturing vaguely toward my flats tucked under my chair, some people just were not built for more. And honestly, he said, raising his glass a little higher, that kind of contentment probably made for a simpler life. The table laughed again, softer this time, almost sympathetic, which somehow cut deeper than the loud laugh at the door had, because sympathy from people who had already decided your ceiling is a particular kind of cruelty, dressed up as kindness so nobody has to feel responsible for it. I did not defend myself. I did not correct him. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, thinking about a 16-year-old named Casey somewhere in the mountains, about my father's radio on his nightstand, about 12 years of loan payments and sleepless nights in a rented hangar that none of these people had ever once asked about the cardiac bill I had quietly paid for the man sitting at the head of this very table, and I felt something inside me go very still and very calm. The exact stillness I had trained myself to hold during an actual in-flight emergency. The kind of stillness that looks like nothing from the outside and is actually everything underneath. Whatever was about to happen, I already knew it was coming soon, and for the first time all night, some small unfamiliar part of me was almost looking forward to it. I glanced once more at Michael, 3 seats up, still laughing politely at something his mother had said, unaware that the next 90 seconds were about to rearrange everything his family thought it understood about his marriage. Somewhere beyond the windows, past the skyline lights, the low western sky had already gone the deep, bruised blue that meant weather was building faster than the forecast had promised, and some small, practiced part of my brain was already running through approach checklists, even as the rest of me sat perfectly still at that table, waiting. It started as a low vibration under the floor, the kind of sound most people in a downtown restaurant would mistake for a delivery truck idling somewhere below, except I knew immediately what it actually was because I had spent 12 years learning to identify a rota signature the way other people recognize a familiar voice on the phone before the first word is even finished. Rota blades. Close and getting closer. A few guests near the windows glanced up, more curious than concerned, and Brian, still holding court mid-toast, kept talking, raising his voice slightly over the noise without seeming to register what it meant, still gesturing with his glass as though the whole world existed only to frame his sentence. Within another minute, the sound had grown from a low hum into something the whole room could feel, a pressure in the ears. A faint rattle in the blinds along the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the adjoining rooftop deck, ice cubes trembling faintly in the water glasses. A spotlight swept briefly across the glass, catching Brian mid-sentence, and this time even he stopped talking, glass still raised as half the table turned toward the windows to see a helicopter descending toward the private helipad, 2 buildings over, landing lights blinking against the darkening sky. Rotor wash bending the potted trees along the terrace below and scattering a stack of cocktail napkins someone had left near the railing. At the next table over, a couple celebrating what I later learned was their own engagement had stopped their conversation entirely to watch through the glass, phones already half raised out of instinct before they seemed to remember it was rude. A server near the dessert station stood frozen with a tray of custard tarts, watching the helicopter's lights sweep the terrace. And somewhere behind me I heard someone murmur that they had never seen anything like this at a family dinner before, which was, in its own small way, the truest thing anyone said in that room all night. The restaurant's manager appeared at the edge of our private room almost immediately, a look of practiced calm on her face that did not quite hide how unusual this was for her, even in a building that occasionally hosted rooftop helicopter arrivals for important events. She scanned the table, found me at the far corner near the kitchen doors, and walked directly past Brian, past Gary and Lauren at the head of the table, straight to where I was sitting, her heels quick and precise against the hardwood. She leaned down and said, quietly but clearly enough that the nearest few guests heard every word, "Miss Bennett, your flight team is here. They said it's time sensitive." The table went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. Bennett was my professional name, the one I had used for Timberline since before I married Michael. The name printed on every press release and every state contract announcement, and apparently the name at least one guest at that table recognized instantly. Because a man near Brian, the same well-dressed stranger he had been talking to when I first walked in, sat forward so quickly his chair scraped the floor and said, loud enough for the whole room, "Wait, Bennett, as in Timberline Air Rescue Bennett?" I found out afterward that the man was a banking executive Brian had specifically invited that night to impress, someone he had been courting for financing on his steamboat development, a man he had spent the better part of an hour introducing to every relative at the table as an important friend worth knowing. That same man now stared at me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and something close to reverence, because his bank, it turned out, had helped underwrite the loan for my company's 4th and 5th aircraft 18 months earlier. Back when I was still just a name on a spreadsheet to him rather than a face across a dinner table wearing scuffed flats. Before anyone could untangle exactly what was happening, James walked into the private dining room in his flight suit, radio clipped to his shoulder, the same calm urgency on his face that I had seen him wear through 100 difficult transports over the years. The kind of face that had learned long ago not to waste time on anyone's confusion but his own cruise. He did not look at Brian, or at Gary, or at anyone else in that room. He walked straight to me and said, "Rachel?" Weather's closing over the pass faster than forecast. We need wheels up in 11 minutes or we lose the window. Casey doesn't have a lot of margin left. I stood up slowly, smoothed my dress, and looked for one long moment at Brian, still holding his champagne glass halfway to his mouth, his toast about contentment and coasting through life hanging unfinished in the air between us like something that could not be taken back. I did not smile in triumph, and I did not raise my voice. I simply said, in the same even tone I used inside a cockpit during an emergency checklist, I have to go. There's a kid who needs a transport crew, and picked up the small bag at my feet, the one that still had my heels folded inside it. Useless now, exactly as useless as they had been the entire evening. For the first time in 11 years of family dinners, nobody at that table had a joke ready. Lauren's mouth was slightly open. Gary had set down his fork entirely. Jessica's hand had frozen halfway through, refilling her wine glass, a thin line of it still running over the rim. And Brian, the man who built his entire identity around being the one who had made it, stood there holding a toast that had, in the space of about 90 seconds, turned into the most embarrassing thing he had ever said in front of the one person in that room he had actually needed to impress. The banker, whose name I would later learn was Robert Callahan, stood up so quickly his napkin slid off his lap onto the floor, and he actually extended his hand across the table toward me, saying he had been trying for a year to get a meeting with Timberline's founder, that he had heard I ran the operation quietly and personally, but had no idea he would end up meeting me at his own client's family dinner. He said it warmly, genuinely, the way you speak to someone you respect, and every word of it landed in that room like a verdict nobody could argue with, undoing 11 years of careful, quiet condescension in about 15 seconds. A few seats down, an aunt of Michael's I barely knew leaned toward her husband and whispered not quietly enough that she always did think there was something more to me than anyone let on. A comment that would have made me laugh out loud on any other night, given that she had spent every prior holiday discussing weather and casserole recipes with me and nothing else. I did not correct her either. I was learning in real time that vindication rarely announces itself as clean as it does in the stories people tell afterward. That most of the time it arrives messy and a little late and dressed up in other people's sudden convenient memory of having believed in you all along. Brian tried to laugh it off, said something about small worlds and how funny it was that Rachel had connections in finance, clearly still trying to reframe the moment as a coincidence rather than what it actually was, a complete collapse of the story he had been telling about me for 11 years. Nobody laughed with him this time. Robert Callahan was still looking at me, waiting for an answer, and Gary had started to ask, in a voice that had lost all its earlier dismissiveness, whether Timberline was the company he had read about in the business section a few months back, the one with the expansion into the western counties. I told him yes, that I had founded Timberline 12 years ago after my father died, waiting for a helicopter that could not reach him in time, that we now covered a dozen rural counties across the state, and that right now, 40 minutes outside a town most of them had never heard of, a 16-year-old was waiting for exactly the kind of help I had spent my entire adult life building. I said it simply, without performance, because it was not a speech I had been saving up for this moment. It was just the truth, finally spoken out loud in a room that had spent over a decade deciding it did not need to know it. Lauren's face did something I had never seen it do before, a kind of quiet unraveling around the eyes, as though 11 years of small comments about my car and my clothes and my unremarkable little job were replaying behind her expression all at once, each one landing differently now than it had when she said it. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, and for the first time in our entire relationship, my mother-in-law had absolutely nothing prepared to say to me. Michael stood up beside me without a word, took my hand, and said quietly to the table that he had known about Timberline the whole time, that he had watched me build it from nothing while everyone else in this family assumed I was just getting by, and that he was done pretending otherwise to keep the peace. It was not a big speech, and his voice shook slightly, but it was the first time in 11 years he had said any version of that sentence out loud in front of his parents. And I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight for a very long time, some old, quiet loneliness finally being answered. James touched my elbow gently, not unkindly, just a reminder that the mountain weather did not care about family reckonings, and said we really did need to move, that the crew was holding the aircraft hot on the pad, and every minute mattered for Casey. I nodded, and the urgency of it pulled me back from the strange, suspended moment of being seen, reminding me that the whole reason any of this was happening at all was a real kid in real danger, not a chance to finally win an argument I had been losing quietly for over a decade. I turned to Gary and Lauren and told them, honestly, that I was sorry to leave before dessert on their anniversary, that I loved them, and that I would call tomorrow, once I knew Casey was stable. I did not add anything sharp underneath it, no parting line about flats or ambulances or contentment, because the moment did not need it, and because some tiny percentage of 11 years of restraint had apparently finally paid for itself in this one unremarkable, honest goodbye that asked for nothing in return. Then I walked out of that private room the way I had walked in, except this time I went straight through the front of the restaurant instead of slipping toward a side door, past the same host who had questioned my shoes an hour earlier, his expression now carefully rearranged into something apologetic, past tables of strangers who had no idea what had just happened 2 rooms over, out onto the rooftop terrace where the helicopter sat waiting with its rotors already spinning, exactly the way it had been waiting quietly this entire time, the wind from the blades pulling strands loose from my ruined clip. James handed me a headset as I climbed in, and through the window, for just a second before we lifted off, I could see the whole private dining room lit up gold against the dark glass. Every single person at that table still standing, still turned toward the terrace, watching the woman they had spent 11 years underestimating disappear into the night sky to go do the actual work of saving someone else's child, her ruined flat still tucked under an empty chair. I put my own hands on the controls 40 minutes later, the way I had 1,000 times before, guiding us down toward a lit clearing beside a rural hospital that looked achingly familiar, close enough to the road where my father had been hurt that I could feel the old ache under my ribs, even through the noise of the rotors, and I thought as Casey's gurney came into view below us, small and pale under the floodlights, that this, exactly this, had always been the whole point, long before any dinner, any toast, any pair of flats had ever mattered at all. Casey made it to Denver Children's, with almost 20 minutes to spare before the pass closed entirely behind us, and by the following afternoon, the surgeons told his mother he was expected to make a full recovery. I did not think about the dinner again until I landed back at our hangar near midnight, exhausted in the specific, satisfying way that only comes from work that actually mattered. Still in my dress, still in my flats, and found 11 missed calls and a string of messages waiting on my phone, glowing in the dark of the empty office. Lauren's first message, sent around 10 that night, was 3 sentences long and included the word proud, a word she had never once used about me in 11 years. And I read it 4 times before I set the phone down, unsure what to do with something I had wanted for so long, finally arriving in exactly the wrong shape. Gary's was shorter, just an apology for the golf comment, and a question about whether Timberline ever took visitors at the hangar. Brian did not call. He sent a text 2 days later, casual on the surface, asking if I had a minute to talk about a potential partnership between one of his developments and a private helipad, and I read it twice before setting the phone down without answering, feeling nothing at all, which surprised me more than anger would have. When I finally called Lauren back 2 days later, once Casey was stable and my adrenaline had settled into something calmer, I told her plainly that I appreciated the message, but that I needed things to actually change, not just for one uncomfortable week, permanently. I told her I would keep coming to family dinners, that I loved Michael and wanted his parents in our lives, but that the jokes about my car and my job and my shoes were finished, and that if they started again, I would simply stop attending, quietly, without another conversation about it, the same way I had once quietly absorbed every comment without another conversation about it. She did not become a different person overnight, and I did not expect her to. There were still a few awkward moments over the following months, an old habit of a comment half started and then visibly caught and swallowed before it finished, Lauren's face flickering with the effort of it. But there were also, for the first time, real questions. She asked once, quietly, over coffee at her kitchen table, what it had actually been like to lose my father that way, and I told her. The whole story, the radio, and the hallway, and the paper cup, and she cried, and it was the most honest conversation we had had in 11 years of knowing each other, longer than any conversation we had had at any dinner table. With Brian, I kept things simpler and more distant. I did not help finance his steamboat development, and I did not pretend the years of comments had not happened just because one dinner had gone badly for him. What I did do, months later, was quietly fund a scholarship in my father's name for young people in Craig who wanted to train as EMTs or flight paramedics, entirely separate from the Whitmore family, entirely for reasons that had nothing to do with Brian or proving anything to anyone at that table ever again. A decision that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with the 19-year-old I had once been, standing in a hallway with nothing to hold on to. The following spring, Timberline opened its newest base exactly 40 minutes outside Craig, close enough to the road where my father had been hurt that I insisted on being there for the ribbon cutting myself, standing in front of a single small building with a landing pad and 2 aircraft that would make sure no family in that corridor ever again waited as long as mine once had. We named the base facility after him, a small plaque by the door that most visitors probably walk past without reading, and standing there that morning in flats again in the same kind of heat, I felt something settle in my chest that no dinner table, no toast, no rooftop helicopter landing could have ever given me on its own. Some debts you do not repay by proving anyone wrong. You repay them by building the thing that should have existed all along. Jessica, of all people, was the one who surprised me most. She showed up at the hangar unannounced one Saturday morning a few weeks later, still in her workout clothes, and asked awkwardly if she could see one of the aircraft up close, admitting in a small voice I had never heard her use before that she had spent years assuming my quietness meant I had nothing worth saying. I gave her the tour myself, and somewhere between the maintenance bay and the flight line, something between us shifted into a version of respect that had never existed before, unglamorous and real in a way none of the dinners ever had been. By the following Thanksgiving, the table looked different in ways that had nothing to do with the food. Lauren asked me, in front of everyone this time, to tell the story of Timberline's newest rural base opening and actually listen through the whole answer instead of redirecting to Brian within 2 sentences. Brian was quieter than I had ever seen him at a holiday, still adjusting to a version of the family where he was no longer automatically the most impressive person in the room, and I found, to my own surprise, that I did not need him to struggle with that adjustment forever. Only that he stopped making other people's smallness the price of his own comfort. Michael and I talked more honestly after that night than we had in years, about the small ways he had let his family's opinion of me stand for far too long without pushing back, and about the small ways I had let my own old wounds convince me that staying quiet was safer than being fully known. We did not fix 11 years in one conversation, but we started actually having the conversation, staying up late at the kitchen table more than once, which was more than either of us had managed before, and it made the marriage feel, for the first time in a long while, like something we were both actually building on purpose instead of just maintaining. I started seeing a therapist that fall, something I had never made time for in 12 years of building a company. And the thing she helped me understand was that staying quiet had never actually been the same thing as staying safe. It had just felt that way because the alternative, being fully seen and still risking rejection, was so much more frightening than simply managing everyone else's comfort at my own expense. Unlearning that took longer than any single dinner, helicopter or not, but that night in August turned out to be the moment I finally understood there was something worth unlearning at all. Looking back now, months later, what stays with me is not the moment Robert Callahan stood up, or even the sound of the helicopter rattling those windows at exactly the right second. What stays with me is the quiet, ordinary drive home from the hangar that night, still in my dress, my flats covered in dust from the field beside the hospital, thinking that I had spent 11 years believing my worth needed to be proven loudly, when really it had been sitting there the whole time, patient and unglamorous, in the shape of every quiet decision that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. The people who measure your worth by your car, your shoes, or how put together you look walking through a door have almost never once asked what you actually carry inside you, and their laughter says everything about the smallness of their attention and nothing at all about the size of your life. You do not owe anyone a helicopter landing on a rooftop to prove you were always enough. You were enough back when you were walking 2 blocks in the heat with damp hair and a scuffed pair of flats, quietly doing the math on how to get through one more difficult evening with your dignity intact. I think about all the people who never get their rooftop moment, who spend an entire lifetime being underestimated by the very people who should have known better, and who never get the specific cinematic vindication I happened to get on one strange August night. If that is you, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need anyone else's recognition to know the truth about what you have built, what you have survived, or what you carry quietly every single day without applause. The value was never in the reveal. It was in everything you did before anyone was watching. I keep telling stories like this one because I think we need reminders that the quiet people, the ones who absorb the joke so the room can keep moving, the ones who pay and fix and stay calm without ever asking for credit, are so often carrying more strength than anyone around them realizes. If this story meant something to you, staying subscribed genuinely helps me keep finding and sharing these true stories, and it does not cost you a single cent. It just tells me to keep going. They looked at my shoes that night and decided they already knew everything about where my life had ended up, and they never once thought to ask where those shoes were actually taking me. I hope you never let anyone else's narrow guess about your life become the whole story either, because most of the time, the people laughing the loudest have simply never bothered to ask the right question. Thank you for listening to mine, and I will see you in the next one.